So this is a good time to, you know, if you're wondering about anything that was said earlier, or there was something on your mind, this is a good time to ask it. So we're just going to open it up.
So is African American considered black, and would possibly people have said other race if they were actually not African American, but maybe Caribbean American?
Let me tell you what the categories are at baseline was, and I don't know exactly what specifically the measure asked, but I'm sure it was white non-Hispanic, was Hispanic, Asian, Native American, African American, mixed race, other.
Other.
Okay, so
Okay.
that's ethnicity.
That's ethnicity. That's ethnicity,
Okay,
yes.
because that's not white. And
Yes, yes, no.
And because the distribution of the sample and at the different time points and depending on the analysis sample, sometimes the number for any particular category is just not enough to model. Then things just have to get combined, or people just have to get dropped out, and so our other kind of starts to kind of encompass Asian, Native American, other.
But we had that mixed category.
And then there's mixed.
16 to 18%, I think.
It's our
were
fourth
mixed.
largest category.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's
all we have is
increasing
mixed
over
with
time.
nothing else. We know nothing else about
Well,
them.
now at age 12, we do have the
Fitness
multi-ethnic identity measure, and the kids can self-identify what group they feel they most belong to, and I'm going to tell you the mixed identifies mixed.
Yeah.
It's not helpful, you know, if you know, but I mean, which is fine, you know, and that's, you know, sort of how they're self-identifying, but it's.
Prior to 12, it was the caregiver that was identifying the ethnicity of the kid. And we saw some ethnicities change.
Mm-hmm. We use child ethnicity
Typically.
primarily because I think there may be some administrations where we don't have the caregiver ethnicity, depending on the interview.
Yeah.
If you're interested in that variable, it's also highly confounded with site. So something you want to pay attention to.
I had noticed that it seemed like a lot of the research that you covered this morning was involved with one or two sites or several sites, but not all sites. And I wondered if you could just tell us, you know, we were speculating why that might be, but it seemed like there wasn't much done on all the sites.
I wouldn't say that.
Or maybe he just didn't cover it.
Yeah, well, some of them were, the numbers were not the 1350. The study that, some of the stuff I went over very quickly and didn't give you all the information. Some we selected subsamples, but they were all the sites involved. But the big problem was early on, Chicago they were so young, and we did the early studies, they were not included. So we didn't select out for any other reason than we didn't have all the data in. We have a rule that we have from the beginning attempted to follow, that we would not publish anything unless 90% of the data were complete, expected data. Yeah, because we didn't want to publish on partial data and then go back and look at something again and things changed.
Okay, so you weren't using things like full information maximum likelihood or imputing data or anything. So that's something that still needs to be done.
But the data set wasn't available for analysis
Yeah.
until
Okay.
it met the
Right.
90% rule.
Okay, I get it.
For that, so one of the solutions at times was to say, I'm going to take 2 sites with the oldest kids or 3
Yeah.
sites with the oldest kids, and I'm going to analyze that data because I have 90% of those 3 sites
Yeah.
are in, and so I can do that. And if I wait, if I want to add Chicago, I can't get 90% for another 2 years or 3 years. And
So it really does mean that in every single paper that's been published, you've actually, with quote, LONGSCAN data, that your population to which you were generalizing changes in every paper practically. Because, I mean, I was talking to you about that, and I think that was one of my major questions, because, you know, I'm always asking my students to think about, well, what is the population to which you want to generalize these results, because that's why we do data analysis, so we can generalize it. So you really have to specify in each paper which population your sample is coming from.
yes, explicitly the 2 West Coast samples, all those children were reported to DSS.
Yeah.
And
Well,
No.
by definition,
Not all of them.
No.
Not the northwest side.
I said,
well, they were all,
okay.
yeah.
Southwest side.
Rules were made to be broken.
Yeah.
But that
There's
was,
still
their,
rules.
their eligibility was through contact with the,
Social
The
services.
family
Yeah,
was
family.
reported. There are siblings in the data set. One sibling could have been the report and the family got into social services, but the other may not have specifically had a report to CPS, which is if you look at the 2 sites, not all of the sites that you think should have a report will have a report.
yeah, you'll find, well, then you raise the issue of siblings.
There's no siblings.
Oh, they're siblings.
Are there?
Oh, it's worse than that.
Oh, you're kidding.
Oh, wait a second, really? I was told there were no siblings.
Oh.
Siblings.
God.
And,
They're sibs.
and we got kids who are living in the same household that aren't sibs.
That's ID numbers. Wait,
Can you identify the siblings? Oh, sorry,
panic.
Not through the data set.
not through
we
what,
don't
not
have-
through.
there's no way to
We
do that.
can, but.
So there's,
they can't,
we have
yeah.
linked, we actually have hierarchical data because of the fact that in some families, 2 children are identified with ID numbers, or 3, or 4.
They will all have unique IDs.
Yes, I understand that.
The
but they're all
ID, to
belonging
the extent
one
that, yes,
family.
I mean, we
won't
undertook
know
this,
the
we
sibling.
looked at it, there's not, I mean, we opted not to do it.
So there's
There-
no way of actually identifying which ID numbers belong to the same family?
Is it a lot of families?
Can you give us
No.
an idea of
No.
how many there
It's-
might be?
Is it not a
Well, it
lot?
wouldn't be that many because they'd have to be the same age at the same time.
Yeah.
or
Right.
Yeah, well,
I mean, I know,
yeah.
but
So we had a
generally.
range, yeah.
20?
But there, but I think it's like
So
20 kids.
10%.
20 kids?
No, no.
20 or so at
San
San Diego.
That's probably 10%.
That's a lot.
I don't
Probably.
think any other site.
I don't,
North Carolina doesn't have any sets.
Yeah, yeah, because they were identified. Yeah, they were
I don't know.
firstborns.
They were all firstborn high-risk infants. So North Carolina doesn't have any SIBs. I don't believe Baltimore has any SIBs.
Probably
And I don't think Chicago has any SIBs, actually. So the only 2 places that could have SIBs are
California.
San Diego and
not. Yeah.
Seattle. And that's because at both of those sites, you could have children in a range of ages because the recruitment was, they had to be less than 4. So
Yeah.
if you had in Seattle, if you had a report made of a family, and there was a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, they potentially, and the parent consented, they both potentially could have been enrolled in.
Well, in our site, they were both removed. And not necessarily to the same home. Now, we've done some things when we were looking at the characteristics of the family. What we did is those that were living in the same home, actually, it wasn't biological that we were interested in, it was if they were living in the same home at the time of the interview, because they could have been at different ages. So you don't want to double count, but we got that information. Yeah, we had come up with actually a paper that we had submitted, it got an interesting review, and then we started to revise, and the question was one of whether or not we really wanted to lock ourselves in. And we decided not to, so we pulled it. But what we had talked about with that approach was the issue of site was one of whether or not the relationship between the independent and dependent variable was the same across sites. And that was really the issue. And that if we could possibly control for, first of all, site well, the other thing is that sites differed on a number of dimensions. Ethnicity was one. And recruitment status was another. If we could account for those with some of the other variables that we had, some of the demographics, and we didn't find any of the interactions of site after that, that maybe that was enough to account for it, as long as we checked to make sure that there were not any interactions. And if we checked, then we didn't need to control for it. So we had this whole procedure of what we were going to do, and we decided we didn't want to go through all of that. So we've We basically have, depending on the research questions that people are asking, they decide, those that are working on the papers, will decide how they want to look at site and how they want to handle it. In some papers, it's just a simple main effect with 5 different groups. Some we've looked at the sites that are similar on the measures, and we've combined them. In other cases, we've actually checked and looked at interactions. In some,
Risk status.
Risk factor, yeah, risk
risk
status.
factors, and in some with the doing some hierarchical modeling.
Included
Yeah,
at all.
yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I think I've observed and talked about with Terry here is that it seems like as the kids get older, the site variable becomes less important in terms of distinguishing, because we now know virtually everything that's happening to these kids from age 4 on. And so the things that distinguish them in the first 4 years make a relatively little difference compared to all the things we know about them in terms of life events and what's happened to them from 4 to 8 or from 4 to 12. And so as the kids get older, a greater proportion of their life is completely described in our data set, and so the variations that made them different at the beginning become less important.
And I think part of the argument is when you control for site, you don't really know what it is you're really controlling for. Because it's confounded with so many things. Like maybe that's a control for ethnicity.
Yeah.
So I think part of our rationale is it's better if you have a clear theoretically generated set of controls that you put in your model without just saying, okay, I need to control for site.
And what are those in your data set? I know like in the CDP data set, the Child Development Project data set, there's certain control variables that you invariably do always enter in all your models. Have you identified the ones that you feel we should definitely include as control variables? Like site is definitely one, ethnicity or not?
Depends.
Depends, yeah.
I mean, it depends on your research question,
Yeah.
what you're modeling, what your outcome is, what your predictors are, what's likely to be confounded with your predictor variables. I
But
mean, I
there
think that's a
haven't
general
been
research
any in
question.
particular that you found in
That are-
analyses have
Depends.
really been important to
There-
control for.
Well,
It depends.
Yeah, it does depend on the variables that we're looking at.
yeah, just as an example, the Baltimore kids have really high self-esteem for reasons that we haven't been able to quite track down.
They're probably
Baltimore.
all
Everyone from Baltimore.
delinquents.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's the success of the Orioles or something that has something to do with it. So disproportionate to any of the other evidence that we have about how the kids are functioning, their self-esteem seems to be a little higher. And so there are some times when it's important to kind of think about the fact that they think a lot of themselves in Baltimore.
In Seattle, caregivers are depressed.
Yeah, that's true. In Seattle, the caregivers have a greater level of depression. But they have cloudy skies all the time, so maybe that's seasonal, so. Yes?
Do you think that being involved in this study affects the outcome,
Yeah.
affects these children in a way that makes them different from other children in similar circumstances?
Well, objectively, I'd say we're a very small part of their lives. I mean, 2 hours every 2 to 4 years seems like it should not be enough to affect. But we do have some families that when we ask them the question, who would you count among your support people? We've had some families that have identified our interviewer who sees them 2 hours every 2 to 4 years as one of the support people for them, which is a pretty sad commentary on
I was
their lives.
thinking more like, if I were a child and were asked all these questions, that it would give me a model of, it would be a model of myself, and what kind of things, what kind of parameters in the world would affect me that other children wouldn't have. And it might change their,
My temptation
My
is to think that
strategy.
2 hours every
Yeah,
4
it's not-
years
yeah,
or
that'd be
every 2
nice.
years is not a significant enough intervention to really change that very much.
Yeah, but it constitutes a type of monitoring,
Yeah.
Yeah.
for- regardless of how infrequently it is. It means that they're special and somebody's kind of watching
That's
for them.
right.
Yeah.
So
Well, we
Well,
have
and
had, we had families that have notified us when they've
When
moved
they've
to
moved,
someplace
yeah.
else and wanted to be contacted. We
Yeah.
usually assumed it was because they wanted the
Money,
$50,
yeah.
the money for to complete the interview, didn't want to lose that income, but.
Well, and we do send out typically newsletters, and we, all the sites do something like that for tracking. Birthday cards and holiday cards, Mother Day cards.
This is a major relationship for some of these kids.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, and what we did in our newsletter is we had some of the kids would make drawings for the staff, you know, the interviewers had gone out. We did a lot of things without identifying people, where they were sort of part of this group.
It's a mixed, I mean, you don't want to have them identified too closely with us, but on the other hand, you want them to contact us and stay in touch and feel like they'll have some obligation to be available for follow-up.
Yeah. Well, and if this was an intervention, a positive intervention, it didn't have all that much of an impact, because our kids are not doing all that well.
They're not using drugs or alcohol.
At 12.
That's
At
what
12.
that's what they're reporting. That's what they're reporting.
Well, and
Okay, well, at least they know they shouldn't be saying they're using it.
Should have told them that they.
well,
Just saying.
Well, that was one of my
age
questions
14,
before.
16.
You know, you do the consent, and now they realize, hey, I'm not gonna tell them about the sex abuse.
Yeah.
But you will, though. I mean, if you look at the self-report, what they're reporting, I mean, the numbers of who are reporting things, I don't think that we suffer from the underreporting we're getting on the trauma symptom checklist at 12.
And we have more kids that tell us about sexual abuse than DSS knew about
Yeah.
ever. But dramatically more.
We had a number of, not a lot, of refusals, hard refusals, where caregivers, and this was a biological dad in one case, said, "You will not contact us again. If you do, I'm going to file a lawsuit. I'm going to," and so we stayed away. But we sort of kept track with CPS to see if the child ever came to the attention of CPS again. And this was after the 4 or 6 interview. And at age 12, we saw her again. She was back in the system for, guess what? Sexual abuse.
By the father.
By the father. Yeah. And so we've had a few cases like that. So there's, one of the things that we've done, it's not going to help you, is we have the lives of these kids, especially our sample again that had been placed in substitute care, is so chaotic. And the talking about family structure and household composition is not anything that most kids experience. And just from some of the data that we're collecting, the quantitative data, doesn't really tell the story of the kids' lives. So what we've done is we've gone back with all the data we have, not just from interviews, but from contacts, trying to maintain contact with the kids, talking to their social worker, whoever we might talk to. We've got all of this information. And we have a set way of reviewing this, and we do life narratives when the kids age out at 18. So we've got from the time that they first came into the foster care mental health project, when they were first reported and entered out of home care, we've got a narrative of what's gone on in their life, who they've lived with, things that have happened, sort of problems they've had. And it's, I mean, the stories, from this, we've got some kids we've identified now who were perpetrators of sexual abuse. And these are kids actually who were reported to CPS as perpetrators. So we...
Does any of that being a perpetrator in the CPS records, does that live in the RNA database at all?
No.
Not up to age 12.
No. No, and actually what happened is we couldn't code it. So we've got a new coding the kids now who are perpetrators, some who were parents in perpetrating and some who were the target or the subject of the report. And that hasn't, I guess officially is not, is it ready? Okay. Yeah.
But we've had to develop a new code form for that.
Recently.
Do you all have sort of recommendations for managing missing data? I mean, I guess coming from NSTAW, where I have, sometimes thousands of kids, and in the sample, if you lose 100, oh well. a little more anxious about preserving sample size in this case to retain power and keep the stability of the estimates going. I mean, do you have recommendations for that? Do you have a protocol or?
Well, the analytic technique that you use, some of it, sometimes it can handle missing data. It depends on what you're doing. When you start looking at over time, you know, it's not so much, missing data is not necessarily a problem, it's how many missing data points you have and, you know, if you got the coverage. And so it really depends on what questions you're asking. If you're doing a simple, you know, outcome at one time and predictor at another time, then there's an issue.
I was going to be running some growth curves, and so, I mean, sort of looking at the missing data structure that Terri presented.
Well, actually, you know, it's in some of the stuff that I didn't go into detail. One, looking at the resilience, I think, I think it was resilience, over time from 4 to 14. Was it that one? But one of them is a certain number, yeah, I think it was a certain number of data points, that if 3 out of 5 data points, if they had that we would include them. And we didn't lose many when we did that. So
it depends.
It depends. You sort of look at you look at the number of missing data points you have per subject, and you might make a decision based on that.
We haven't set forth any standard protocol for handling missing data over longitudinal, you know, models. Different people have done it different ways. Sometimes we simply just say, okay, we lost 20%, we've got complete data for these time points, that's what we're going to use. Sometimes we handle it another way.
But in your experience, are there publications out now where, I mean, you've got 2 different kinds of problems with missing data. I mean, you talked about some kids who drop out but then come back, so that those missing data are sort of bounded by data, but then you've got attrited out, right, and you lose them. So if you have the easier case being a child who maybe drops but then returns, will you or will some members of the team have they imputed that missing spot, or maybe done some sort of imputation, or do they just keep it in a stacked set and just use the data that are there and not try to fill that missing hole?
The latter. We have not done any
I don't think we've done any imputations to date, but we are also probably in the last 1.5 to 2 years moved more into our more sophisticated longitudinal modeling, but a lot of the techniques that we use sort of handle those missing data, so we put in what we have and the model deals with it in the way that the model deals with it.
Are you depending on full information maximum likelihood to?
Depends on the model.
As the estimator?
And the technique. Depends on the model and the technique.
Have you seen any rhyme or reason to patterns of missingness? I mean, like if they're changing caregivers, or I mean,
when I looked at, I did a rather. I mean, you thought my presentation this time was long. You should have seen the one on nutrition with Chapel Hill a couple of years ago.
I didn't think it was long though. You shouldn't be so apologetic. It was fine. You could have talked about missingness.
I looked at a lot of different factors. I looked at CBCL. I looked at Patel. I looked at changes in caregiver. I looked at who the caregiver was. I looked at ethnicity, site. I looked at all kinds of information in terms of seeing if there was something about the sample that you could pull out and say this looks like this is something that's non-random about it. I didn't find anything other than at certain time points or places, site and to some degree ethnicity, but it kind of depended. But for the most part, the sample, I did not find anything over time that was systematic.
So otherwise, you could characterize it as at least missing at random.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I've always done, because people, often reviewers, you know, this is one of the things they harp on is, you know, how much missing data do you have? And the thing is that if you use a program like AMOS or M+, that in which you can use, no matter what your analysis is, in which you can use full information maximum likelihood, then, you know, you're using all the sample that you have, but you can also then just delete all of the people who are missing, fit the model again and compare. And then you're doing a sensitivity analysis, which really is showing you whether there's some real difference between the full sample and those who have complete data. And oftentimes there is very little difference, especially if it's missing at random, as you're just saying, so that at least appeases reviewers. And then we'll say, oh, okay. But then it doesn't matter which one you report, because basically your results are pretty stable. So that's what I always use to convince reviewers I'm doing the right thing. And I can be pretty damn persuasive.
That's clear.
What do you mean?
Have you constructed standardized rates to compare either with the NIST studies or with national reporting norms on what the differences might be given your interview data that you've gotten to estimate incidences and prevalences that might differ from other reporting methods?
No, we actually, that's a paper that we've talked about doing just systematically. I mean, the one thing, just looking at the data, the thing that strikes me is that we seem to have protected our kids from being sexually abused by, in the sense that, given the number of kids in our sample and how many kids we have who have been sexually abused, it's remarkable actually how few of them have been compared to, I mean, the prevalence data that David Finkel and Murray and other people have in terms of 20 or 25%. I mean, we're less than 10%, including as teenagers, including with other people. So it's outside the family. So it's really, I mean, one wonders what that is, and I've speculated that maybe it's because we've got a social services involved sample and there's kind of a higher level of scrutiny that's going on with these kids, and so maybe it's hard to believe that that's going to protect them, but maybe it is. I mean, I'm a little puzzled by kind of why there's so little sexual abuse.
Maybe high-risk kids define sexual abuse differently, cognitively.
Yeah.
Although we ask the questions.
We
in
do ask
reasonably
about
standardized
specific
ways.
behaviors, yeah.
We ask them in pretty standardized ways, and so we're a little
Well-
surprised at how low that is.
Yeah, one of the things that we have been attempting to do is to extend LONGSCAN. I mean, we figure we've got an interesting sample with a lot of data, and we just finished a proposal to do another interview. I'm not sure that we would archive it here. If you guys are still around. Well, I don't know if, but when the kids are 22 to 25. And one of the things we're focusing. Pardon?
We'll hang in there if you guys.
Okay. It's a deal. We get the money, we'll tell them that they got to give you money too.
They have to give us money for the archives in order to archive.
Exactly.
I think we can feed off each other.
But one of the things that we talked about, for this right now, we're focusing on substance use and risky sexual behavior. But we had talked about, wouldn't it be interesting to do retrospective reports as young adults about history that might be more comparable to some of the other data that people have collected. And it might be, with some time, we might get different rates of reporting.
And Kathy Whittam has written about looking at that retrospective issue of asking adults and raised concerns that that's really not a very good way of doing it, but it would be interesting. The other proposal that I think would be interesting to do is to gather our participants all in a room when we get done and present our results to them and sound them out about kind of, does it feel like we're talking about their experiences in a more of a community-based participatory research strategy with our subjects now that they're as adults, and have that in a conversation with social service people in the room, so there'd be engage in a dialogue about kind of what it felt like to go through the social service system.
I was talking to somebody about, forget, Ray, what we did with the moms. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
Chris, yes. The moms who we had to go get consent, and we did a little qualitative study.
Yeah, it was only a very small sample of mothers whose parental rights had been relinquished, but not quite, but they weren't living with their children. And one of the interesting things about that was every single one of the moms, cognitively, it was still their kid and they were going to be reunified, and no matter how messed up their lives were, it's when I get my kids back and this is what I'm gonna do, and it was interesting because the system looked at it entirely differently, that this person no longer was a parent, basically. So it was.
And they were living in rehab, homes, and
yeah,
really messed up. But they still were going to get their kids. This was 6-7 years after the kids had been removed. They were going to get them back.
And they'd had their rights terminated.
yes, but not quite.
Pardon?
They still wanted consent.
Yeah, that was. Yeah.
Even though the rights were terminated, they still wanted consent from them.
These are the ones the rights hadn't been terminated. It was the ones whose rights had been terminated. We could get it from whoever was then the legal responsible.
But we have felt for a long time that a more qualitative approach with some selected sample of our group would really be helpful, particularly if we want to turn it into a monogram.
Yeah.
Something we've been talking about in San Diego a lot is kind of developing more of a person-centered approach.
Yeah.
And so rather than trying to fit the experiences, based on the variables and all these interactions, we want to look at, are there certain patterns of interactions or, maltreatment experiences that occur across the sites or across kids. And you could do that with looking at the severity and type. Right now what I'm doing is just looking at the type. So just yes, no, at different age periods. And that's actually working out pretty well. Getting into severity, you're getting into latent profile analysis or latent transition analysis if you take it longitudinally. And so that can be done. And that's actually kind of probably a better way to get at those issues, because otherwise there's just too many interactions to look at.
One of the things that we've done, and we've wrestled with whether we can count predominant type by which is the most severe, using the severity codes.
The hierarchy.
And use a hierarchical system. And that seems like it works in some situations, but not every situation.
Yeah, we've seen about 3 studies that have come out in the past year that have done this latent class, latent profile type of procedure. And I think pretty much across the board, the more types of maltreatments that have been experienced have been related to worse outcomes.
Yeah.
Just generally. But that's of course not looking at these types longitudinally and using retrospective reports and all kinds of other issues that we can get around with our data that other studies aren't able to.
Right.
So.
Jonathan Koch published a paper looking at early neglect and its
Yeah.
relationship to subsequent aggression. But I'm involved in analysis now in which it looks like later domestic violence exposure has more potency for explaining age 8 trauma symptom checklist and behavior problems at age 8 than that earlier neglect that Jonathan found in his analysis. So it's the same subjects analyzed in a somewhat similar way, but but looked at slightly different with a different question and comes out slightly different. And so it's kind of, it depends.
Yeah.
It does depend. It also depends on what modeling strategy you're using. For example, with the Jones et al. Paper was doing ProcTraj and using trajectory models, looking at 0 to 4, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, and what she was finding is the variability was so limited in the time frames that what she went back is recoded to 0 to 2, and that actually gave her the variability that she needed in terms of making those trajectories work better.
And part of that reason was she included all sites, and she had 2 sites, and actually not just 2 sites, but part of the North Carolina site and part of the Chicago site all have been reported prior to age 4. And actually, the studies that we did in the special issue of child abuse and neglect selected all kids who had a report prior or between birth and 8. And so those were from all the sites. But when she was modeling that, since she had some sites that had all reports, that caused some problems in terms of the modeling.
In other cases, it depends on what you're looking at or when you're lining up in terms of the outcome you're assessing, what makes sense in terms of how to measure or quantify that time frame. So, I mean, it just depends.
I guess one can test at different cutoff scores and see what's most sensitive.
Now, and what I mentioned a study that Laura Proctor was doing, looking at just the Seattle and San Diego sites where they had all been reported and looking at trajectories after that. And that was very different. The research question was a very different question. You know, with a sample of kids who were reported earlier, what does their trajectory of reports after that look like? And that's very different than the trajectory of reports for a sample over time.
I just have two questions. One, I noticed that the measures change for various reasons. So I wonder why you decided to use the multi-group ethnic identity measure. What was your rationale for using that? And then also, what was your rationale for dropping it at age 14? And also, the trauma symptom checklist, you've been alluding to some problems with that measure, and I want more discussion about what the actual problems are.
Well, first, the ethnic ID, that's based on, it's Finney's
It's a child
measure.
self-report.
Yeah, it's a child self-report. And that was one of the issues that we, I guess, had talked about wanting to have a measure. But there were questions about whether or not at age 8 it was, appropriate. And we also, in terms of the measures, we made decisions about what measures to include so we could do all the programming. We tried to do it, well in advance, and when North Carolina was coming in, and we were always under the gun because their kids were aging. And I'm trying to think, when we made the decisions for age 8, it was probably early on, 93, 94?
Probably 93.
93. So, you got to sort of put it into the context of what was going on at the time and what was available and the measures that were just coming out. And I think that's one reason why.
And it wasn't picked up at 14. I think in part, 14 was funded by NICHD. A big component of that was mental health, and we included the DIS, the Diagnostic Interview Schedule for Children, which ate up a huge block of the interview time. So the other LONGSCAN measure administered at that time had to be cut down significantly. So we focused on, at 14, on some of the sort of core things administered, and then why it wasn't picked up at 16 or 18. I mean, also I think in terms of measurement was what was of interest at the time. Those have evolved over time too. For example, I think at 18 there was a big interest in height and weight and obesity and eating and things like that, and so that kind of ended up at 18 and not, in prior interviews. So I know at 14 a lot of things didn't even get included at 14 because the sort of crux of that interview in part was pretty mental health based and just took up such a big block of interview time.
Yeah, I probably should have mentioned one of the other factors we considered in identifying measures was the total interview time. And I think with early on the kids, we wanted under an hour. As they aged, we were hour and a half at the longest. For the caregivers, we were up to 2 hours. But we pushed it. I mean, we always pushed it. And the interviews actually were quite a bit longer. Age 12 was quite long. I think we had some people that refused to participate after that because of the length of an interview. So we were a little sensitive to that. So we had to make some decisions about what it was that we really needed to get, given the time that we had. So we were always making those decisions.
And we didn't think that the kids' ethnic identity issue of changing from 12 to 14 or 16 was as important in terms of sorting as a question for us. As an example, is looking at whether youth labor and work and finishing school. And so at each point, at age 12, we said, what are the major developmental tasks they have to do? What can we fit in here? At age 14 was funded to look specifically at developmental psychopathology, so the DISC was in. At age 16, we kind of came back to kind of dating and mating type behaviors and substance abuse. And at age 18, we were kind of looking at school completion and work, and not that we wanted to and life skills, yeah. So it was a compromise, and we all sat in a room, and with 5 investigator teams and coordinating center kind of fighting it out question by question as to which instruments or questions of instruments were going to be included. And so that's part of the reason for the change. And even the BSI versus CSD got down to how long is this interview going to take versus this many questions versus that many questions, and I'll trade you this if you'll do my instrument and that kind of, it's just a little bit like the US Census goes through and tries to figure out what they're gonna include.
You want to address that?
Trauma symptom checklist. We noticed there was a fairly significant decline in trauma symptom scores between 8 and 12. And in looking at the validity scales, the underreporting scale, that, like I think I mentioned earlier, almost 50% scored in the range that Rae R would suggest are not valid due to under-responding. That seemed to be a pretty hefty number of people that the recommendation might, theoretically according to the manual, would be to drop those participants.
But we did talk to John.
I was gonna say, yeah, why don't you tell him what his response was?
In personal communications with John Rae R was that, that's interesting. Well, nobody pays attention to those scales anyway.
Yeah, so what do you do? What do you do with those that come out on that? He said, well, come to think of it, I don't think we've done anything.
Yeah. Well, it actually got triggered because at age 8 there was a significant number of kids who were on the underreporting scale of under-response, who were also and concurrently were on the over-response. Yeah. And so we kind of scratched our heads and said, what does that mean? Why is there something significant about this? And so we called John and talked to him about it, and John's responses, we never look at that anyway.
Yeah, we didn't look at that anyway.
So, and then that became the answer for the second one, but we still are a little troubled by why all these kids who had distress at age 8 are all looking pretty good at age 12.
Just the entire sample. I mean, there's just a marked drop. I've looked at the 10 items that go into the underreporting scale. I've looked at all of the items. I've looked at anything that look like patterns of under-response. I have tried to see if there is some explanation in terms of method of administration, order of administration, to the extent that the data would allow me to look at that, and it really doesn't, because our interview, the order of the forms are not randomly assigned, so it's the same across all the interviews. If there was a different shortened version of the interview, it just means certain measures were not administered. It doesn't change the order. So to some degree, I'm bound in terms of trying to explain that by administration order or type of administration, because those are the same. I have looked at age, and it does seem to be that even within age 12, the older kids are less likely to under-respond than the younger ones, but that's within a group. It doesn't really explain the fact that the whole group does it. Ethnicity, site, always to Sunday to try to figure this out, and we're left at the end of the day with what do we do with these data? They seem to be odd in this way, and they do. What we have done is look at, okay, well, let's divide the group into maltreated, non-maltreated. What does, given the trauma symptom checklist scores at 12, can they distinguish the groups? And they do. So we've decided that the data are what they are, and move ahead. We've tried to explain it. We've looked at it. I think we've done our very best to come through what we can to try to explain it, and one can make the decision that just seems sort of funky. I'm not going to use it, or I'm going to drop out half the sample and just use those that don't seem to be under-responding. My best guess is it's something funky. It's something funky about 12-year-olds. I really do think, I'm not kidding. I really do think it is something developmental about that specific sort of age group on that particular measure.
That seems like a very plausible explanation. 12-year-olds are fairly labile. They have, in some areas, they're very developmentally advanced. In other areas, they're, like emotional regulation. At some level, they can maintain basic societal expectations, but there's a lot of lability built in there. You catch them on another day, and you get a completely different answer.
I have seen at least one study looking at the stability. I think it was of might have been of depression or something that was measured over time, and the least stable time frame was around that time. which, you know, leads me to believe that we sort of have what we have, and it probably is more of a reflection of a developmental period issue, not of anything wrong with our data in particular. And again, it does sort of distinguish the two groups. I mean, it distinguishes those that are maltreated than non, or maltreated kids are, you know, have higher scores.
Now, you were
than
looking
non.
at patterns on other measures over
Yeah,
8
we
to
compared
12
to
on the
CBCL,
CBCL and don't see
mhm.
the same kind of drops. You know, so.
Does
No.
each 12 include the sex concern scale?
Yes. No, 8 does, 8 does
8
not,
doesn't and
12 does. Mhm.
So maybe that could.
Yeah, I think part of the message of this discussion is that in this data set, there is multiple opportunities to do measurement studies.
And I should say that our 16 data, the scores go back up. They go from 8 markedly down to 12, and then a slight coming back up. So they don't come back up to the levels at 8, but they come back up from what they were at 12. So there seems to be kind of a coming back of an increase, which I think is probably a leveling out to what it probably should have been likely at 12.
You spoke about sort of how to deal with the CESD changing to BSI. Are there a variety of approaches to dealing with different ways that things are measured over time that are worth mentioning, sort of different approaches that you guys have seen taken? Or that's not a very specific question, but sort of a range of approaches?
We've invented, each new paper, new investigation has kind of addressed those issues kind of de novo again to see if there's a different way of playing with it. We haven't, I mean, you'll need to remember that we're kind of busy collecting new data, so we're kind of our ability to go back and really massage stuff.
But were there any papers that you admired? You thought, ooh, I wish I'd thought of that. Not yet, no.
No, I think Deborah Jones's effort right now to do the trajectory modeling has got us all thinking very clearly about whether there are ways to do it, and her approach was to look at the exposures as trajectory modeling. We're actually also thinking about looking at the outcomes in a trajectory modeling, and then trying to I'm sorry, she's looked at the outcomes, we're also looking at exposures as trajectories, so we're doing it both ways.
Exposure trajectories, so
Yeah.
one, a
And then,
single
but you would
outcome.
just, for measures that were more of a linear model, you would move them into percentiles or something like that for the trajectories, or could you fit those into trajectory modeling if, you know, at
Different
one
measures,
of those
yeah.
ages, you've got a different measure? I mean, because with her trajectory modeling, she has she has the maltreatment data, and it's the same at every.
Right, it'll be a challenge to do it with the other one. I mean, that BSI is we're gonna live to rue the day that we said, why don't we do the BSI instead of the CSD, it'll save us.
No,
There's a
we
way
can
to
use
fix
the,
that.
we can use
You
the
can
cut
fix
point.
No,
that.
she was talking about that.
The way we did in Jonathan's paper, we just standardized it, we centered it.
That's,
Well,
yeah. Well, the other way is that the
Means zero
CSD does have a standard cut point.
Yeah, I don't know
And the
if it is.
BSI,
Right, but
BSI
if
does
you
too.
look at your
Yeah.
CESD, it's,
They
you know,
have
like
some
40%
items that are
meet
the
it,
same.
and then it's
Yeah, it
a
doesn't-
huge
it's
They're
difference.
worded
Proportionally,
differently,
it
but
doesn't
they're
end up being
same.
quite the
Yeah,
same.
but
The
that's
thing
another
is,
way.
I published a paper in which, as long as you have some items that are somewhat similar, you can use different items across time if you make a latent variable.
that's the other way.
Rather than,
That's the other way.
you know, just using observed variables. And so it is possible, it's Pettit, Kiley, and a bunch of people, and it,
Again.
and it basically is talking about how as long as you have constrained the construct across time to be the same, you can use it in growth
Mhm.
modeling or just about anything else you want. So it's not as big a problem, I agree with you, as it sounds like at the moment. And there are many ways
Like
around it, yeah.
Well, it's been an interesting challenge putting this together and kind of corralling 5 other institutions into playing along with us and sets of investigators, and we've learned a lot about each other, and we can actually take each other's roles at the meetings. We know which person's gonna say no first, and which person's gonna say, sure, we can do that, and sometimes they'll switch roles just for fun.
I have a question about using control group. Probably each site has very different characteristics of control group, because the control group should be matched to that maltreatment sample each site has collected. So are there some specific challenges and solutions that, if you want to use cross-site data and have control versus maltreated group, is it very...
What Diana English did was to pull the non-maltreated group together and then pick matches among the maltreated group to match the non-maltreated group in order to do the maltreatments wake paper. And so that's one solution, was because the non-maltreated kids were the smaller group, was she used that and then used the larger group to find the matches. And so that's one strategy to do it. It wasn't ideal because there's still some site differences in that paper, but that was one attempt at doing that. And so that's the paper that's the final paper in that special issue of Child Abuse and Neglect called On Maltreatment's Wake. Are there other papers that come to mind?
With control groups? Depends on what you're controlling for.
And how you define it.
Yeah, if you're talking about controlling for maltreatment, that's one thing, but then there are other things within a maltreated group that you might be interested in looking at.
That should, yeah.
And I know we have at least one PI that would say we don't have any controls in LONGSCAN. LONGSCAN is all at risk or maltreated.
But by the same token, every site had its own internal comparisons planned to begin with. So we just to pick, since we have San Diego well represented, the kids that were still in foster care originally and the kids who had been in foster care and gone home. And then there are the kids who've been, have more permanent placements and kids who've come back and forth in the system. So that site, and then the Seattle site has the kids who were substantiated and the kids not substantiated. The kids in Chicago, there's some pretty clear comparison groups. Baltimore has comparison groups in North Carolina. So each of them has their own comparisons. But in some ways it has borne fruit that cross-site comparisons, I mean, looking at the different sites and how they perform has taught us a lot more than if we just had one of those individual studies.
And you have to look, even at recruitment, it was a control. Doesn't mean it stays that way. I mean, those kids certainly can move into the maltreated group. Given most of them, while they were controls, they were at risk for something. For some, either social or demographic or high risk on some measure of prospective maltreatment risk.
So do we have a lot of children who moved from control to maltreated because later they had records, right?
If you look at by, I don't know, 12 or 14, probably over 60%, 65 or something % of the sample have some report of something.
I'm trying to think of the exact numbers, but there's, for instance, North Carolina started off with 33% by definition were maltreated, and it's like 45% a few years later, and the Seattle group started off with 60% substantiated, 40% not substantiated, and moved to a much higher percentage because many of the kids that were not substantiated first came back in the second time and were. And Baltimore, similarly, Baltimore claimed when we first talked with them, we don't have any kids that were reported for maltreatment, and it's crept up over time. Even deciding whether failure to thrive ought to count as a reported group. And there's some interesting issues about Baltimore that either prenatal exposure to HIV or failure to thrive, are those kids that should be counted as maltreated, but a lot of them have moved into a pretty clearly maltreated group over time.
But I really want to thank these folks for coming and making this such a productive day. It's having done this for several years. I mean, this is going to save these folks a lot of time and effort, I can guarantee you that, and they're going to get off to a much quicker start than if we just turn them loose in the lab with the documentation and say, good luck. So,
we can still say good luck.
We didn't discourage people, though.
Well, I hope we didn't. I'm sure you didn't discourage people. You let them understand the richness of the data. So much to be discovered.